A college student vanished from her friend's house in the middle of the night while the others were asleep in the next room. No one heard or saw anything unusual, but by morning, she was gone. Police were called in right away, and the case instantly became the most talked about story in the city. Detectives chased down thousands of leads before finally uncovering the unexpected truth that shook the entire country to its core. Brianna Dennison was born on March 29, 1988, in Reno, Nevada. She grew up there with her parents and younger brother, until, when she was 6, her father passed away unexpectedly. The loss hit the family hard, but it brought Brianna even closer to her mom, and she did everything she could to help. Her family also loved to travel. Brianna made it through half of Europe, visited Japan, and even spent a year in Italy on a student exchange program. After graduating high school, she headed to California to attend Santa Barbara City College. She'd always wanted to work with kids, so she set her sights on becoming a child psychologist. In Santa Barbara, she quickly found a circle of friends and started dating a guy. In the winter of 2008, 19-year-old Brianna was on a college break and came back to Reno to spend time with her family and friends. On Friday, January 18th, she headed over to her best friend's house, planning to stay there for the weekend. Along with another friend, they had their days all planned out, skiing during the day, then attending concerts and nightclubs in the evenings. On Saturday, January 19th, Brianna was supposed to go to a concert by one of her favorite bands, but she came down with a cold. Still, her mom encouraged her to go anyway, so Brianna decided she didn't want to miss it. A few hours later, she left the concert a bit early to head back to her friend's house, hoping to keep her cold from getting worse. The house wasn't far, but it was freezing outside, and she didn't want to walk. She spotted a car pulling out of the parking lot and asked the driver for a ride. He agreed, and she made it home, where she started waiting for her friends to get back from the concert. They showed up around 3:30 in the morning. The girls chatted for a bit before heading to bed. Around 4:30, Brianna sent a text to her boyfriend, and then fell asleep. Her friends were sleeping in the next room while Brianna had crashed on the couch in the kitchen. But around 9 a.m., when they got up and started making breakfast, Brianna was gone. At first, they didn't think much of it, figuring she just moved into the bedroom, which had the door shut. About 40 minutes later, one of them knocked on that bedroom door to wake her up for breakfast, but there was no answer. She knocked again, still nothing. Finally, she opened the door and found out that the room was empty. The friends searched the entire house and quickly realized Brianna wasn't anywhere. But all of her things, her phone, purse, clothes, even her shoes, were still there. The whole thing felt wrong. It was below freezing outside, and they couldn't imagine any reason she would walk out in just a t-shirt. They called her mom, but she had no idea where her daughter could be. She rushed over right away. And in the meantime, the friends spotted something deeply unsettling. On the pillow where Brianna had been sleeping, there were a few small reddish stains, looking an awful lot like blood. Panicked, her friends called the police, and officers were on the scene almost immediately. They didn't find any signs of a struggle inside the house, but a few things stood out right away. The blanket Brianna had been sleeping under was lying several feet away from the couch, and the stuffed teddy bear she'd been using as an extra pillow was missing. There were no signs of forced entry either, but the friends told police they never locked the front door, which just so happened to be right in front of where Brianna had been sleeping. From the very first hours, detectives started leaning towards the theory that she'd been abducted. It seemed unlikely she would have walked out into the freezing cold in just a t-shirt, but they still couldn't figure out how someone could have taken her without waking the two other girls sleeping in the next room. Forensic experts soon came up with the most plausible explanation, based on the pillow Brianna had been using. First, they confirmed the blood on it was hers. Then they determined that the killer had likely pressed her face into the pillow with enough force to keep her from making a sound. The crime lab also swabbed the front door handle and found DNA belonging to an unknown man, someone who wasn't in the system. With no other useful clues inside the house, police launched a massive search across the city. They also began going door to door in the neighborhood, asking men to voluntarily provide DNA samples. Meanwhile, detectives dug into Brianna's phone and found a string of messages from her boyfriend. On the night she vanished, he had sent her multiple insults, and her friend said the two were on the verge of breaking up. Investigators briefly considered him a suspect until they confirmed he was in another state at the time and couldn't have been involved in the abduction. From the very first days, Brianna's disappearance became the biggest news story in the city, and soon it spread across the entire country. Her photo was plastered on billboards, and local media ran constant updates on the case. In total, police collected around 3,000 DNA samples from local residents, but the city's crime lab simply couldn't handle that kind of workload. Authorities turned to the public for help, quickly raising $150,000 to cover additional testing. Eventually, experts managed to process every single sample, but not one of them matched the DNA of the suspected abductor. Soon, the FBI joined the investigation, focusing their efforts on finding the suspect. Detectives first looked into the man who had given Brianna a ride home that night, suspecting he might have returned later to abduct her. After the media reported that police wanted to speak with him, the man came forward, provided a DNA sample, and presented a solid alibi, clearing him from their list of suspects. Another lead came from a man who lived directly across the street from Brianna's friend's house. He told police that he hadn't been sleeping that night and was sitting in his living room. Around 5 a.m., he noticed a shadow pass in front of his window, followed by the sound of someone trying to open his front door. After several failed attempts, the noise stopped. At first, he didn't think much of it, assuming it was just someone drunk who had mistaken his house for their own. With each passing day, the search efforts grew. Volunteers joined the police, helicopters scanned the area from above, and officers with search dogs combed through hard-to-reach places like forests, fields, and drainage ditches. But none of it led anywhere. Based on the evidence they had, detectives doubted this was the suspect's first crime. They began digging into the unsolved cases in Reno, and soon found two incidents that caught their attention. In November 2007, just a few months before Brianna vanished, an unknown man attacked a 21-year-old college student. She was in a parking lot when he ran up, knocked her to the ground, pulled a gun, and assaulted her. He told her to keep quiet, but instead, she screamed at the top of her lungs. That seemed to scare him off, and he took off running, dropping a pack of condoms in the process. A month later, another attack happened. This time, the victim was a 22-year-old student standing outside her home when a man ran up from behind and covered her mouth and nose, causing her to lose consciousness. She woke up in the cab of a pickup truck. A few minutes later, the driver pulled over and sexually assaulted her, ordering her not to look at him the entire time. When he was done, he drove her back to her house and told her not to turn around as she walked to the door. She went straight to the police and gave a partial description. It was a white male, heavy-set, with tanned arms. She also described his pickup truck, adding one chilling detail. Inside, there was a child's shoe. There was another disturbing link between the two attacks. In both cases, the attacker took the victim's underwear with him. Investigators collected DNA from both women, and the samples matched each other. Now, detectives working Brianna's case requested a comparison with the sample from the door handle, and it came back as a match. This confirmed their worst fear. They were dealing with a serial predator who targeted women for sexual assault. Once this information hit the news, another student came forward. She told police that one night someone had tried to break into her home, yanking on the front door handle so hard it actually bent. But whoever it was didn't manage to get inside. Using the description from the other two victims, police put together a composite sketch and a profile of the suspect, a man of average height, between 28 and 40 years old, with a solid, muscular build. His portrait was sent out to local newspapers and TV stations, along with a public plea for help identifying him. Panic began to spread through Reno. People realized there was a serial predator operating right under their noses, and feared it was only a matter of time before he struck again. Gun and pepper spray sales skyrocketed, and women were terrified to stay home alone. But even with the public's intense pressure, investigators still weren't any closer to making an arrest or finding Brianna. With each passing day, hope that she might be alive grew dimmer. Divers were sent to search the local river for her body, joined by hundreds of volunteers braving the freezing cold. Police also received over 5,000 tips, but not a single one brought them any closer to finding Brianna. This went on for almost a month, until police finally got a call. On February 15th, a worker was heading out for his lunch break. To save some time, he decided to cut through an abandoned lot on his way to a cafe. As he walked, he spotted a discarded Christmas tree lying in a ditch and noticed a pair of socks sticking out from behind it. When he got closer, he saw what looked like a human figure. At first, he thought someone had dumped a mannequin, but it didn't take long for him to realize it was a body, and he immediately called police. Detectives sent the remains to the medical examiner to confirm the identity and determine the cause of death. The victim was completely naked except for socks, and lying next to the body were 2 pairs of women's underwear. The examiner confirmed it was Brianna. She had died from strangulation, and based on marks on her neck, the killer had used underwear to do it. According to the pathologist, Brianna was murdered inside the house, and her body was later taken away. This meant she had been dead since the very day she disappeared. As for the underwear, 1 pair belonged to Brianna's friend, who hadn't even realized they were missing, but the second pair wasn't hers. Detectives believe the killer deliberately left them at the scene to taunt police. Brianna had also been sexually assaulted, and male DNA was recovered from her body. As expected, it matched the samples from the 2 earlier assaults and the one found on the doorknob. The news of Brianna's body being found hit the entire city like a punch to the gut. Thousands of people had been following the case, clinging to the hope that she might still be alive. In the weeks that followed, police kept working to identify the killer, but every lead they chased ended in a dead end. A few weeks later, they decided to share more details with the public, revealing that the perpetrator seemed to collect his victims' underwear. Investigators hoped that maybe a relative or acquaintance had noticed something suspicious like that, but no useful tips came in. From that point on, the investigation all but froze, even though dozens of officers were still on the case. Weeks turned into months, and despite all their efforts, it was starting to feel like the killer had managed to get away with it. But everything changed on November 1st, almost a year after the murder. Police got a call from someone who wanted to stay anonymous. This person said that a while back, her friend found women's underwear in her boyfriend's pickup truck. When she asked him about it, his excuse sounded beyond suspicious. And there was more. Shortly after Brianna's murder, this man sold his pickup and left town. That man was 27-year-old James Bila, and police quickly turned their attention to him. James was a former Marine with extensive training in martial arts. At the time of Brianna's murder, he was working construction jobs and had spent a lot of time on projects near the university, right in the area where Brianna's friend lived, so he knew the neighborhood well. Digging deeper, detectives learned that James had a violent streak. His ex-girlfriend told them he had hit her multiple times and had once nearly killed someone with a knife. There was also an incident where, without any reason at all, he broke a dog's leg. Even with all that, James had never faced any charges, and police had never collected his DNA. Detectives soon learned he had already moved back to Reno, so they put him under round-the-clock surveillance. They also gave him a call, saying they wanted to talk. James agreed to meet, but didn't even bother asking what it was about. The next day, he sat down with detectives, and they asked where he was on the night Brianna was killed. James claimed he had been at his girlfriend's place, but when they asked for a DNA sample, he flat out refused. Right after that, police went to his ex-girlfriend, and she told them his alibi was a complete lie. He hadn't been with her that night. They also learned that James and this woman had a 4-year-old son together. Investigators asked the mother if they could take a DNA sample from the boy, and she agreed. Lab results showed the killer's DNA was a near-perfect match to the child's, which essentially meant someone in the boy's immediate family was responsible for the crimes. Now that they had all this evidence, detectives went back to James, but this time it was to arrest him. He was hit with a long list of charges connected to all 3 cases where his DNA had turned up. Still, he refused to admit any guilt. James was sent to jail to await trial while investigators kept building their case. When they spoke with his father, they learned James had a long history of drug abuse, one of the main reasons he'd been kicked out of the Marines. Detectives also tracked down his old van, and testing showed that fibers from the seat covers were an exact match to fibers previously found on the clothing of another student who'd been kidnapped and driven home. His former employer had something to add as well. According to him, James quit his job the very same day Brianna's body was found, and then took off to another state. When the trial began, James' attorney tried to argue that the cases weren't connected, that each crime had a different signature. But those claims didn't hold much weight, especially with the prosecution's long list of evidence tying James to every one of them. And it didn't help his case that during the proceedings, James kept smiling and even smirking. In late May 2010, just over 2 years after Brianna's murder, the jury found him guilty on all counts. That left the court to decide his sentence, and the death penalty was on the table. James' lawyer pushed hard to avoid the harshest punishment, telling the judge about his client's troubled childhood, how his alcoholic father would regularly beat him, and pointing out his good behavior in jail. None of that swayed the judge, and James was sentenced to death. Just a few months later, he picked up 4 additional life sentences for other charges, meaning that even if his execution never happens, which is entirely possible, he still has no chance of ever walking free. In the years that followed, James' lawyer tried several times to overturn the sentence, but each time the state's Supreme Court upheld the death penalty. As a result, James remains behind bars, with no set date for his execution. After his arrest, Brianna's family pushed for a new law in Nevada requiring police to collect DNA from anyone arrested for a violent crime. They believed that if such a policy had been in place earlier, James would have been caught after his first attack on a student, and Brianna's life might have been spared. Tragically, her death wasn't the last blow to the family. Exactly 10 years after her murder, her 19-year-old cousin went missing and has never been found. She told her parents she was going to another state with a guy she'd recently met, and then stopped answering her phone. Her family fears something terrible happened to her, and they still hold out hope that one day she'll come home. Jennifer Teague was born on June 30th, 1987, in Ottawa, Canada. The youngest of 3 children, she'd always been looked after by her 2 older brothers. After her parents divorced, Jennifer and her mom moved in with her grandmother, while her dad lived close by and stayed an active part of their lives. During her school years, Jennifer threw herself into sports. She played baseball, soccer, and was absolutely obsessed with hockey. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters of her favorite players. Around the same time, she discovered a passion for protecting the environment and even joined a group that visited elementary schools to teach kids about the importance of taking care of nature. When she got to high school, Jennifer started picking up part-time jobs to cover her own expenses and put a little aside for the future, even though she still wasn't sure what she wanted to do after graduation. She thought about studying fashion design, but she also considered a career in protecting the environment. In September 2005, when Jennifer was 18, she started her senior year of high school and was already counting down the days to her graduation. She kept working evening shifts at a local Wendy's while juggling school, and around that time, she adopted a kitten from a shelter. She couldn't wait for her next paycheck so she could pay for the kitten's shots. On Wednesday, September 7th, Jennifer came home from school, took a short break, and then headed out to the bus stop to get to the restaurant where she was scheduled for the evening shift. Around midnight, she closed up the restaurant and started walking home. By then, the buses had stopped running, so Jennifer had to walk a little over a mile. Even though it was late, most of her route was along well-lit main streets, so she wasn't too worried about her safety. After all, it was the same walk she made almost every day. After leaving work, Jennifer decided to call 2 of her friends who were also finishing their evening shifts nearby. They agreed to meet up outside a 24-hour convenience store about halfway between her job and her house. The three of them sat there for about an hour, chatting and sharing stories from their day. At about 1:30 in the morning, Jennifer said goodbye to her friends and started heading home. She had about an 18-minute walk left. The next evening, Jennifer's mom began to worry. She hadn't heard from her daughter since the night before. Jennifer's room was in the basement, so when she came home late from work, no one in the family ever saw her. In the mornings, she usually left early to catch the school bus before her mom and brothers were awake, so they wouldn't see her then either. But when Jennifer didn't come back from school and didn't answer her mom's calls, the worry turned into real fear. Jennifer always let her know if she was going somewhere, but that day, there was nothing. Soon her mom learned that Jennifer hadn't shown up to school at all, and later she missed her shift at the restaurant too. That's when the panic set in. She called all of Jennifer's friends, but no one had seen her since the night before. Jennifer's dad also said she hadn't contacted him. With no answers, her parents went straight to the police and reported her missing. Even though Jennifer was already 18, local police didn't waste any time and launched a search right away. While officers questioned Jennifer's friends and classmates, her family and neighbors split up to help. Some searched the streets, while others printed and posted flyers with her photo and information about her disappearance. The first thing police considered was that Jennifer was unlikely to have run away on her own. Her family and friends all described her as extremely responsible, someone who had never disappeared for even a few hours without letting someone know where she was. Next, detectives started piecing together Jennifer's movements that night. They spoke with her friends, who said she headed toward home around 1:30 in the morning while they walked off in the other direction. But investigators soon uncovered something interesting. Jennifer hadn't left work alone. A coworker named Mark had walked with her for part of the way before she split off toward the convenience store, where her friends were waiting. When detectives went to talk to Mark, they immediately noticed several fresh scratches on his face, something that looked suspicious right away. He insisted he'd cut himself while shaving, and even showed them his razor, though of course that didn't prove anything. Detectives began to wonder if Mark might have had something to do with Jennifer's disappearance, and whether those scratches were left behind as she tried to fight him off. Still, there was no real evidence to link him to a crime, so they asked him to take a polygraph test. Mark agreed, and the examiner found no signs of deception. That result made investigators begin to doubt his involvement. Detectives also looked into Jennifer's ex-boyfriend. He told them that he and Jennifer were still on friendly terms, but that he hadn't spoken to her that night and had been home the entire time. He, too, agreed to take a polygraph test, and when the results showed no signs of deception, investigators crossed him off their list of suspects. Soon after, police turned their attention to another possible suspect, a 21-year-old local named Boris. According to Jennifer's friends, he knew her, and they'd even seen him drive past while they were sitting outside the store that night. Digging deeper, detectives learned that Boris had a troubling reputation. He was known for odd behavior, and in the past had even been accused of stalking women, with a restraining order issued against him. People who knew him often described him as paranoid. Jennifer's friends also revealed that shortly before she vanished, Boris had asked her out, and she had turned him down. Armed with this information, detectives went to speak with him. Boris denied having anything to do with Jennifer's disappearance, but he was noticeably nervous and struggled to answer some of their questions. Still, he allowed them to search his car without a warrant. Right away, investigators noticed that one of the windows was shattered. They considered the possibility that it had happened during an abduction, but Boris insisted it had been broken on a different day. He also agreed to a polygraph test, and the examiner reported no signs of lying in his responses. So, despite his odd behavior and concerning past, detectives found nothing concrete linking Boris to Jennifer's disappearance. Officers, along with Jennifer's family and friends, kept searching all over the city, but they couldn't find Jennifer or any trace of her belongings. Meanwhile, a new theory started spreading through Ottawa. Some believed a serial killer might be behind her disappearance. Just 2 years earlier, a woman named Ardith Wood had vanished on the other side of the city, and days later her body was discovered in a river. Police had never caught the person responsible, and now people feared that the same predator could be connected to Jennifer's case. With no solid leads, investigators poured everything they had into the search. They set up a command center inside a church near the convenience store where Jennifer was last seen. Hundreds of locals came to help, splitting into groups to comb through different parts of the city. Police brought in search dogs and even used helicopters equipped with heat sensors. Detectives also went door to door, checking every house along Jennifer's route home. Before long, they got a potential lead. A woman who lived on the edge of Jennifer's neighborhood reported hearing a piercing scream around 1:30 that night. She looked out her window, which faced the main road, but didn't see anything suspicious and chose not to call the police at that time. Now, however, detectives believe that scream may have been Jennifer's. Given the timing and location, it could very well have been the moment she was abducted. Not long after, another neighbor came forward, saying he too had heard the scream that night. But like the first witness, he hadn't seen anything that could point investigators toward a suspect. A week went by with no sign of Jennifer, and not a single real lead, and hope of finding her alive was fading fast. That's when detectives officially reclassified the case as a possible homicide, giving them access to even more resources. They held a press conference, asking anyone in the city with information to come forward. Jennifer's parents also spoke directly to her presumed captors, pleading with them to let their daughter go. But in the days that followed, the search kept coming up empty, so investigators tried a different approach. Jennifer's neighborhood was mostly made up of private homes with their own yards, and technically, police would have needed a search warrant to search each one. No judge was ever going to sign off on hundreds of properties. So instead, detectives went door to door, asking for voluntary permission. Almost everyone agreed, and officers combed through hundreds of yards and houses. But even then, they didn't turn up a single clue. That went on for several more days, until everything suddenly changed. On September 18th, a week and a half after Jennifer disappeared, an off-duty officer took his family to a park on the edge of the city. As they walked along a trail, he caught a familiar smell of decomposition and followed it into the woods. Just a few dozen feet from the path, he spotted a human body, partly covered with branches and leaves, and immediately called it in. The remains were turned over to medical examiners, since the body was far too decomposed to be identified visually. All of the clothing was missing as well. Investigators suspected it might be Jennifer, so the lead detective made a calculated move. He instructed his team to set up a police tent near the parking lot at the beginning of the trail, so the press wouldn't discover the real location. The idea was simple. Only the killer would know the real spot where the body was hidden. Not long after, medical examiners confirmed the remains were indeed Jennifer's. But because of the level of decomposition, they couldn't determine an exact cause of death. Her body was sent to a lab in Toronto for further analysis, but the results were the same. Still, one thing was absolutely clear. This was no accident. It was murder. After Jennifer's body was found, police once again turned to the public for help. This time, they released several dozen surveillance images taken inside the convenience store where Jennifer had spent time with her friends on the night she vanished. Detectives believed her abductor might have been in the store, spotted her there, and then waited for the right moment to follow her home and attack. Investigators worked to identify every person who appeared on the footage, but a handful of men still remained unknown. Around the same time, another possible lead surfaced. After news of the body broke, a witness came forward, saying he'd walked through the same park early in the morning on September 8th. He recalled seeing a man standing near the entrance of the trail, and he'd gotten a clear enough look at his face to help police put together a composite sketch. Detectives believed this man was very likely Jennifer's killer, and they hoped someone in the community would recognize him. The problem was, The sketch came out vague, lacking detail, and it could have resembled a lot of different people. That triggered a new flood of tips, but every lead ended in a dead end. To make matters even more frustrating, two separate people actually confessed to killing Jennifer. After careful investigation, police determined both men were lying. Neither had the opportunity to commit the crime. They just wanted the attention. From that point on, the case basically stalled. Tips were coming in less and less often, and police still had no evidence that could bring them any closer to solving Jennifer's murder. Sometime later, investigators got word from their colleagues that the case of Ardith Wood, the woman killed 2 years earlier, had finally been solved. The killer turned out to be a local man, and detectives immediately looked into whether he could also be responsible for Jennifer's death. But it didn't take long to confirm that he hadn't even been in the city at the time of her abduction, so any possible connection between the two crimes was ruled out. By early 2006, detectives made a few more pushes to get answers, once again appealing to the public for help, but none of it led anywhere. That's how things stood until June 9th, when detectives got a completely unexpected call. Staff at a local hospital reached out with a bizarre story. A man had run into the street completely naked, screaming, "I killed Jennifer Teague." Police rushed to the hospital, and when they questioned him, he actually admitted that he was the one responsible. But there was one major problem. Tests showed the man had taken 5 times the normal dose of hallucinogenic mushrooms. Once he sobered up, he told investigators he didn't remember anything about making that confession and had no idea why he said it. According to him, he had nothing to do with Jennifer's murder. He only knew about it from the news. He claimed that on the night Jennifer vanished, he had been at a friend's house playing video games. But there was a catch. When detectives went to question the friend, they discovered he'd recently been in a serious accident that left him with partial memory loss. He couldn't recall what happened that night, or even who he'd been with. Still, detectives couldn't ignore the situation and decided to dig deeper. 24-year-old Kevin Davis had no criminal record and worked at a local pizzeria. What stood out most, though, was where he lived, directly across the street from the woman who had reported hearing a scream, and only a few dozen feet from the church where police had set up their command center. As detectives pieced everything together, they stumbled across something striking. It turned out they had already spoken with Kevin in the very first days after Jennifer disappeared. Since he lived in the neighborhood, officers had knocked on his door with their standard questions. Back then, Kevin told them he'd been home all night, and his mother, who was sleeping in the next room, backed up his story. But now, almost a year later, he was claiming he'd actually been at a friend's place playing video games. And that wasn't the only red flag. Reviewing the case files, detectives found a tip that had come in right after Jennifer's body was discovered. Someone had suggested they take a closer look at Kevin because he resembled the composite sketch. At the time, investigators dismissed it as just one of hundreds of leads with nothing concrete to back it up. But now, with his drug-fueled confession combined with all these inconsistencies, Kevin suddenly looked much more suspicious. Still, there was one big problem. There wasn't a single solid piece of evidence against him. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing tying him directly to Jennifer's murder. And Kevin wasn't confessing anymore. With the case hanging in limbo, detectives began wondering how they could ever hold him accountable. For the next few weeks, detectives kept digging, revisiting files, brainstorming new angles, searching for anything they might have missed. But nothing came together. Eventually, they started to fear that Kevin would never be arrested, that he'd slip away and remain free. But then, out of nowhere, everything changed, and in the most unexpected way. On June 26, just a few weeks after being released from the hospital, Kevin walked up to his neighbor and said he needed help. When the neighbor asked what was wrong, Kevin told him to call the police because he had killed Jennifer Teague. After that, Kevin went to a nearby store where he came across a police officer. He calmly approached him and repeated the same thing. he had murdered Jennifer. He was taken straight to the station, and this time detectives made sure to cover every detail so that Kevin couldn't walk back his confession later. They read him his rights, then brought in medical staff to test his blood for drugs or alcohol. The results came back clean. Only then did they turn on the camera and begin recording as Kevin gave his confession. Kevin told detectives that he carried a deep hatred toward women for most of his life because they never loved him. In the days leading up to Jennifer's murder, he started going out at night, taking his mother's car and driving around with a knife, rope, and a gag. He admitted he was hunting for a vulnerable victim, guided by two simple criteria. She had to be young, and she had to be defenseless. His original plan was to abduct someone, bring her back to his house, and sexually assault her. He also said he finally made the decision to act after two personal blows, losing his job and the death of his beloved pet. On the night Jennifer disappeared, Kevin parked near the convenience store and spotted three girls sitting outside, laughing and talking. He stayed back, out of sight of the cameras, and waited for them to split up. Sitting in his car, he thought through how he'd carry out the abduction. Around 1:30 a.m., Jennifer said goodbye to her friends and walked down the road toward her neighborhood. Even though the street was mostly well lit, there were stretches of darkness, and Kevin attacked her in one of those spots. He forced her into his car at knife point and drove her to his house. Since he lived with his mother, who was asleep in the next room, he had to stay quiet. Using the knife to threaten Jennifer into silence, he led her to his bedroom and tried to sexually assault her, but he couldn't make it. Enraged, Kevin strangled her to death, and his mother, sleeping just on the other side of the wall, heard nothing. After getting his confession, detectives asked Kevin to show them where he had left Jennifer's body. He pointed them straight to the real location, not the decoy site where police had set up a fake tent for the press, but the actual spot that only investigators knew about. That detail alone confirmed he was telling the truth. Finally, Kevin explained why he had decided to confess, and his answers stunned the detectives. He said that after officers showed up at his house a few weeks earlier, he became terrified, convinced he was about to be arrested. His paranoia spiraled out of control. He truly believed police were watching him at all times. At work, he even demanded that a coworker lift his shirt so he could check for a hidden wire. Living in constant fear, he decided the only way to end his torment was to come clean, completely unaware that, in reality, detectives had no evidence at all. If he had kept quiet, he might have escaped justice entirely. In the end, Kevin was charged with murder and sent to jail to await trial. From behind bars, he tried to take back his confession, but this time, he had no chance. The trial began in January 2008, and once again, Kevin chose to plead guilty. That decision made the proceedings move quickly, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after at least 25 years. In his final statement, Kevin claimed he regretted what he had done and said he would gladly give his own life if it could bring Jennifer back. But Jennifer's father, who sat in the courtroom that day, later admitted he didn't believe a word of it. To him, Kevin's so-called remorse sounded more like a calculated attempt to soften his sentence than anything genuine. In the end, Kevin was sent off to serve his time, with no guarantee he'll ever be released once those 25 years are up. And one last note. Back in 2015, Jennifer's father published a book about the case and how their family managed to survive the unthinkable. He explained that his main goal was to help others who've lost loved ones, showing them that no matter how dark it gets, it's still possible to find a way through the pain. Andrea Del Vesco was born on June 29, 1994, in Chicago, Illinois. She had an older brother, a younger sister, and parents she was incredibly close to. Andrea also came from a well-off family. Her dad ran an investment firm. After her little sister was born, the family moved to Austin, Texas, where Andrea enrolled in a prestigious Christian school. She stood out fast. She played on the field hockey and lacrosse teams and racked up a bunch of awards, especially for studying languages like Spanish and Latin. When she graduated, Andrea applied to several top colleges. In the end, she chose UCLA, planning to earn degrees in psychology and Spanish. She loved the language and seriously thought about moving to a Spanish-speaking country one day. Her parents had hoped she'd pick a university in Chicago because her older brother was studying there and could keep an eye on her, but they ultimately supported her choice, and she headed to California. In her first week on campus, she joined a sorority and quickly made friends. Andrea moved into the dorms with them and spent the next few years working hard toward her degrees. She also picked up part-time jobs whenever she could. Even though her family could provide everything she needed, she wanted to pull her own weight. In 2015, when Andrea was 21, she entered her senior year. At UCLA, sorority and fraternity members in their final years could rent small apartment-style complexes just off campus. It was considered a big deal, both prestigious and a chance to finally live a bit more independently outside the dorms. Andrea and her sorority friends jumped at the opportunity and rented a place just a short walk from the university. Around that same time, Andrea adopted a little chihuahua from a shelter, and soon after, she began volunteering there on a regular basis. September was an especially important month for her sorority. It was recruitment season, when they welcomed new freshmen into the house, so Andrea and her friends were busy preparing for it. On the night of September 20th, they spent hours working together, setting up displays, painting posters, making decorations, and getting everything ready for the big event. As the night wore on, the girls started heading to their rooms one by one. Andrea stayed up with a friend in the living room, chatting until 3:30 in the morning. Eventually, she dozed off on the couch, but a little while later she woke up and went to her bedroom. A few hours later, Andrea's roommate, who lived upstairs, was suddenly woken by the sound of a woman screaming and a dog barking. The noise seemed to be coming from downstairs, so she tried calling her, but Andrea didn't pick up. Concerned, she decided to call the police, and officers arrived within minutes. By the time they entered the building, everything had gone quiet. They walked through the place but didn't find any signs of a break-in or anything unusual. Most of the other girls were still asleep, so the officers chose not to disturb them. Thinking it might have just been a nightmare, or maybe nothing serious at all, they left. But only minutes later, Andrea's roommate heard a loud crash from below. She rushed out onto her balcony, and that's when she saw smoke pouring from Andrea's room, followed by flames spreading fast. To her shock, she also saw a man wrapped in a blanket running out of Andrea's room. At that moment, the fire alarms went off, and the students started evacuating. Some of Andrea's friends tried to get into her room, but the door was locked. A strange detail, since the girls never locked their doors. Using a spare key, they finally got it open. Inside, Andrea's room was filled with smoke and flames. Through the haze, they could barely make out the outline of a person lying motionless on the bed. They shouted Andrea's name, but there was no answer. The fire spread too quickly, and they had no choice but to get out. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was in chaos. The students huddled outside, and it didn't take long for everyone to realize Andrea was missing. The fire spread quickly through the building, and it took 32 firefighters more than 15 minutes to finally put it out. When they were able to enter Andrea's room, they found a body lying on the bed, and that's when the police immediately got involved. The fire had done so much damage that the body couldn't be identified by sight. It was handed over to the medical examiner, but detectives quickly realized who it had to be. Other students told them that the room was Andrea's, and she was the only one who hadn't made it out that night. Firefighters also found Andrea's chihuahua alive in the room, and the dog was quickly taken to a vet clinic for treatment. Even though medical confirmation would take time, word of the tragedy spread across campus almost instantly. Within hours, thousands of students at UCLA had heard about it, and most assumed Andrea had died in some kind of accident, maybe an electrical short, or something like a candle left burning. But firefighters had their doubts right away. All the outlets were intact, and there was no sign of any accidental source of fire in the room. What they did notice was strange. Sitting on the bed, right next to the body, was a trash can. That in itself seemed suspicious. After looking more closely, they concluded that the fire had started there, which meant someone had put the trash can on the bed and deliberately set it on fire. It was nearly impossible to believe Andrea could have done that to herself. Firefighters shared their findings with the police, and soon, forensic investigators were going through the room in detail. What they discovered made the case even darker. There were large bloodstains spread across the bed and on the floor. That detail alone shattered the theory of a tragic accident, because in a real accidental fire, there would have been no reason for blood to be there at all. Meanwhile, the medical examiners worked to confirm the victim's identity, but the fire had been so intense that even her fingerprints were gone. In the end, they were able to confirm it was Andrea by using dental records. What they found next was shocking. Her body showed 19 stab wounds, which completely ruled out any possibility of an accident. There was another crucial detail. The examiners discovered no smoke in her lungs. That meant Andrea was already dead before the fire even started. As for sexual assault, there were no clear signs. But because the body was so badly damaged by the flames, they couldn't say for certain. What they could confirm was that there was no trace of the attacker's DNA left behind. The case was now officially a homicide investigation. ABD detectives began questioning all of the sorority members who lived in the complex. They learned Andrea didn't have a boyfriend at the time, and she didn't seem to have conflicts with anyone. One of the students, the same one who had called the police before the fire, shared an unsettling detail. That night, she had driven her boyfriend to the airport and got back home around 5:30 in the morning. She entered the courtyard of the sorority house, where the stairs led up to her room. As she walked up and started unlocking her door, she suddenly heard a noise behind her. When she turned around, she saw a man standing at the bottom of the stairs, and the moment he noticed her, he bolted. Frightened, she quickly went inside her room. She thought about calling the police, but convinced herself not to. Maybe he was just someone visiting one of the other girls, or maybe another student passing through. She hadn't seen his face clearly, but she remembered what he was wearing: a black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt, and jeans. Still unsettled, she phoned her boyfriend and told him what happened. He reassured her, and eventually she went to sleep. But just 45 minutes later, she woke to the sound of commotion downstairs, the same noise that made her call the police. After the officers left, she once again heard noises. Stepping out onto her balcony, she caught sight of a man climbing out of Andrea's window, wrapped in a red blanket. And she instantly knew it was the same guy she'd seen near the staircase less than an hour earlier. She shouted after him, but he ran off. She rushed outside, hoping to see where he went, but by then he was gone. What she did notice, though, was a red Nissan driving away from the area. She couldn't make out the license plate, but there was something else on the rear windshield. 3 big letters. She recognized them right away. It was the abbreviation of a fraternity called Lambda Chi Alpha. Detectives were intrigued by this lead, but they also knew it might not mean anything. That neighborhood was packed with students and notorious for big parties, so the red Nissan could have just belonged to some random college kid heading home from one of them. Still, investigators followed up. They questioned every member of Lambda Chi Alpha, the fraternity whose letters were spotted on the car, but none of them admitted to owning a red Nissan, nor did they know who it belonged to. Detectives then spoke with students who lived in the complex across the street from Andrea's, and that's when they learned about another crime that same night. The students said their place had been burglarized. Someone had stolen a laptop, a Bluetooth speaker, and a few other items. This detail caught investigators' attention. They soon learned that in order to use that stolen Bluetooth speaker, the new owner would first have to register it online through the manufacturer's website. Detectives wasted no time. They reached out to the company, handed over the serial number, and asked to be alerted the moment someone tried to activate it. While detectives waited for a call, news of Andrea's death spread far beyond the UCLA campus. At first, investigators didn't reveal that they were dealing with a homicide. Most people, including Andrea's own family, believed she had died in some kind of tragic accident. Her parents only learned the awful truth later from Andrea's sorority sisters. By then, her family had already flown to Los Angeles. Her mother demanded to see the body herself because she couldn't bring herself to believe Andrea was really gone. As for Andrea's dog, vets tried desperately to save the little chihuahua, but it didn't make it. Heartbroken, her parents went to the clinic to say goodbye and later said that at least the dog would now be with Andrea in heaven. Meanwhile, detectives were still chasing the lead on the red Nissan, but came up empty-handed. Days passed with no progress until the call finally came in. The stolen Bluetooth speaker had just been activated, and the detectives now had an IP address. It traced back to a man named Joseph, living in Fresno, about 3 hours away from UCLA. Police headed straight to his home, and Joseph admitted he had registered the speaker online, but insisted it wasn't his. He said it belonged to his roommate, a man named Alberto. According to Joseph, Alberto had left for Los Angeles a few days earlier to attend a concert and came back on September 22nd, just one day after Andrea's murder. When he returned, he wasn't empty-handed. He brought back the stolen Bluetooth speaker, along with other random items like dishes, towels, and bottles of alcohol. When asked where it all came from, Alberto told him a friend in Los Angeles had just moved and gave him the things he didn't want to take along. Detectives dug deeper and found out Alberto was a 22-year-old student at Fresno State University who had no criminal record. Still, his whereabouts were unclear, and it took investigators several days to track down the house he was staying in. On September 26, officers surrounded the home and arrested Alberto. At the station, he claimed he had gone to Los Angeles to visit a friend who lived near UCLA. Together, they went to a concert, then spent the next few days hopping from party to party before he headed back home. When a detective asked him about the Bluetooth speaker, Alberto pretended not to know what they were talking about. But once they confronted him with proof that the stolen speaker had been found in his roommate's home, his story changed. Now, he said the speaker had actually been brought by his friend from Los Angeles, who supposedly gave him a ride back to Fresno. But detectives quickly uncovered another inconsistency. Alberto's own roommate told them he saw Alberto return home alone, carrying the speaker and the rest of the stolen items into the garage. Caught in the lie, Alberto switched his story again. This time, he admitted he had stolen them himself. He explained that he and his friend had gone to a student party that night where some of the people were acting rude. Drunk and annoyed, he decided to teach them a lesson by stealing their things, laptop, the speaker, and whatever else he could grab. He insisted he was so intoxicated that he barely knew what he was doing. Alberto added one more detail. He claimed that around 5:30 a.m., after leaving that party, he and his friend were confronted by a man hiding behind a dumpster. The man pulled out a gun and demanded their stuff. Instead of handing it over, they ran, and the stranger fired a shot in their direction. When detectives asked for a description of this gunman, Alberto gave one, and it matched perfectly with what Andrea's neighbor had seen that same night. Detectives, of course, weren't quick to buy Alberto's story, especially since no neighbors had reported hearing gunshots that morning. Still, they pressed him further, asking if he had gone into any women's dorms while he was in Los Angeles. Alberto said he had met 2 students through a mutual friend, but insisted that was the extent of it. Detectives pushed harder, telling him they didn't believe a word he was saying. Under pressure, Alberto changed his story yet again. This time, he claimed that during the same party where he'd stolen the speaker, His friend Eric had met a girl who lived just across the street and decided to go with her. Alberto said he didn't know her name, but when he gave a description, it matched Andrea. Then he went further. He described what she was wearing that night, even down to her underwear, and eventually slipped up and said her name. Detectives realized he was likely lying, spinning stories as he went along, but they also knew they had to squeeze out as many details as possible. When they pushed him to recall more, Alberto put his head in his hands, went silent for a few seconds, then finally muttered, "All right." It was Eric. According to Alberto, just minutes after Eric went off with the girl, he came running back, clearly shaken. He told Alberto they needed to get out of there immediately because he had done something serious. Eric admitted he had attacked the girl, and together they left the party. According to Alberto, Eric threw away a pair of rubber gloves as they left, gloves he'd been wearing when he came out of the student's house. Finally, Alberto claimed that sometime later, after the party, he saw news of Andrea's murder and realized what his friend had done. He messaged Eric demanding the truth, and Eric confessed to killing her. Detectives still weren't convinced by Alberto's shifting story, but they had no choice but to check it out. They asked where Eric lived, and Alberto pointed them to an apartment complex just 5 minutes from Andrea's place. Police knocked on Eric's door and started asking questions about that night. Eric admitted that he and Alberto had been at the party, but claimed nothing unusual happened. According to him, they got back to his apartment around 3 a.m., and he didn't wake up until closer to 8. He also said he had been very drunk, so his memory of the night was fuzzy. Detectives kept pressing, but Eric stuck to his version. That's when police noticed something important. Eric's apartment complex had surveillance cameras everywhere, so they immediately pulled the footage from the night of Andrea's murder. What they saw blew holes in both men's stories. The footage showed Alberto and Eric walking back into the building at 2:40 a.m., and right away, detectives spotted something striking. One of them was wearing a black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt, and jeans, the exact outfit Andrea's neighbor had described. And it wasn't Eric. It was Alberto. Later footage showed both men leaving the apartment again around 4:30 a.m. They went downstairs, hung around drinking for a while, and then disappeared off camera. The next time they were seen was at 7-Eleven that morning, returning home. And there was no mistaking it. Alberto was wrapped in the very same red blanket Andrea's sorority sister had seen on the man fleeing her balcony. By this point, detectives had little doubt about Alberto's involvement, but they were still trying to figure out what role, if any, Eric had played. They brought him back in for questioning and showed him the surveillance footage, demanding he come clean. But Eric stuck to his story. He claimed he was so drunk he barely remembered anything at all, not even leaving the apartment or where they had gone. Even so, investigators now had enough evidence to arrest both men and secure search warrants for their homes. Once they were booked into jail, officers noticed something troubling. Alberto's hands were covered in scratches. They looked exactly like defensive wounds, marks someone might leave behind while fighting him off. When asked about it, Alberto shrugged it off, saying he got into a fight at a party, but couldn't remember with whom. Soon after, forensic teams combed through Eric's apartment. They spotted stains that looked like someone had tried to wash away blood, and quickly sent the samples to the lab for testing. Next, detectives tracked down Alberto's car, the red Nissan with the fraternity letters on the back window. It turned out Alberto had once been a member of Lambda Chi Alpha, but not at UCLA. He'd been a part of a chapter in Fresno before being kicked out for bad behavior. Finally, police searched Alberto's home. What they found left no room for doubt. A trash bag containing the same red blanket seen by Andrea's neighbor, a bloody knife, and Alberto's clothing, including his underwear. Even more disturbing, the bag also contained a pair of women's underwear. All of the evidence was sent to the lab for testing. In the meantime, one of Alberto's neighbors came forward with something that immediately caught detectives' attention. He said that when Alberto came back from Los Angeles, he told them that a student had been murdered right across the street from where he'd been at a party. What stood out wasn't just that Alberto knew about the killing, it was the level of detail. According to the neighbor, Alberto described the crime scene in graphic precision: that the victim had been assaulted, stabbed, and then the house was set on fire to cover it up. None of those details had ever been released publicly. Alberto even boasted that the police would never catch the person who did it, because the crime had been done too cleanly. Detectives strongly disagreed, though. They kept digging into the mountain of evidence piling up against him. When forensics finished processing Alberto's car, it too was covered in blood. Samples from the vehicle, the knife, and Alberto's clothing all came back with the same result. The blood belonged to Andrea. With that confirmation, prosecutors moved forward. Both Alberto and Eric were formally charged with murder. But detectives still weren't convinced Eric had played an active role. He might not have even known what his friend had done. But with the evidence tying both men to the scene, they had little choice but to charge him alongside Alberto. After they were locked up and this information hit the news, a new witness came forward. He told police that around 5:30 that morning, he had been outside near Andrea's house collecting plastic bottles. While he was there, a man walked up to him and asked if he knew how to fight. The witness said no, and the man headed straight toward Andrea's building. The witness also noticed a red Nissan parked nearby, with another person sitting inside. When detectives brought him to the station, he immediately identified the man who had approached him. It was Alberto. This testimony became an important piece of the puzzle. It showed that Alberto had been the one who approached Andrea's home, while Eric had been sitting in the car. That made Eric's direct involvement in the murder seem even less likely, so investigators now leant toward the idea that Eric truly might not have known what his friend was about to do. Eventually, prosecutors changed Eric's charges. Instead of murder, he now faced counts of aiding and abetting, along with burglary from the other house that night. In 2017, Eric's lawyer negotiated a deal. The prosecution agreed to try him separately from Alberto. Eric pled guilty to the reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison. Alberto's trial began in 2018, and by then, prosecutors had added another charge: animal cruelty, because of the death of Andrea's dog. The prosecution laid out an overwhelming case against him. They argued that Alberto had climbed into Andrea's home through the balcony. Maybe at first he didn't plan to kill her. Maybe he just wanted to steal something valuable. But when Andrea woke up and saw him, she screamed. That's when, according to prosecutors, he pulled a knife, sexually assaulted her, and stabbed her repeatedly. Afterward, he set a trash can on fire to destroy evidence, grabbed a blanket, and fled the scene. The defense, on the other hand, had nothing substantial to counter the evidence. They couldn't present a single strong argument for his innocence. So it didn't take long for the jury to reach their decision. Alberto was guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for September 21st, exactly 3 years to the day after Andrea's murder. On that date, the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He emphasized one thing in particular. Throughout the entire trial, Alberto had never shown an ounce of remorse and never admitted to what he had done. In the end, Alberto was sent away to serve his life sentence. But even after the trial was over, one detail continued to haunt Andrea's parents. As we know, Andrea's roommate had already called the police before the fire even started. And based on the timeline, Alberto was likely still inside her room when the officers arrived. He probably stayed hidden, waiting for them to leave, or maybe even threatened her with a knife to keep her silent. That left a painful question Andrea's parents could never escape. Was Andrea already dead at that point, or was she alive, silenced by Alberto at knife point, too terrified to make a sound? They'll never know for sure. But in their eyes, one thing was clear. If police had checked Andrea's room that night, their daughter might have had a chance to survive. Her parents repeatedly criticized the police department for failing to conduct a more thorough search, but no action was ever taken against the officers. Their explanation was that when they walked through the house, they saw nothing to suggest danger. No signs of forced entry, no sounds of a struggle, only silence. And without stronger evidence, they said, they didn't have enough cause to take further steps. Ellen Wake was born on May 17, 1995, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Later on, she moved with her parents and sister to Ohio, where the family settled in Westchester Township. From a young age, Ellie stood out for her creativity. She loved making little crafts and decorations out of anything she could find. She also had a thing for bright, quirky clothes that always made her stand out from the crowd. She felt most at peace in nature, climbing trees, stringing up a hammock, and just soaking in the quiet. She could spend hours like that. After finishing high school, Ellie went to a local college and got her cosmetology license. Not long after, she landed a job as a hairdresser. By the summer of 2018, 23-year-old Ellie was living on her own and still working at the hair salon. On Sunday, July 29th, a friend came over to visit her. They hung out in the backyard for a while, chatted, and then he left. After that, Ellie texted with a few of her friends, but the next day, she suddenly stopped replying. Her family and friends kept trying to reach her, but there was no response. When they called, they realized her phone had been turned off. A little while later, Ellie's mom drove over to her house and saw her car still parked by the garage. All of her personal belongings were inside, except for her phone. It didn't make any sense, and Ellie's mom immediately went to the police. She also told them right away that she had a strong suspicion about who might be behind her daughter's disappearance. Ellie had told her multiple times about an anonymous man who had been stalking her for months. It all started in February 2018, about 6 months before Ellie disappeared. A strange man began messaging her on social media, and at first he seemed harmless. But then, his messages started getting creepier. He asked her bizarre questions about her thoughts on mass murders, and just generally acted weird. Ellie tried blocking him, but every time she did, he'd pop back up with a new account under a different name, or message her through a different platform entirely. But that was just the beginning. In April, Ellie received a video from him, filmed late at night through one of her windows. In the clip, she was in her kitchen, quietly putting stickers into a scrapbook. Judging by the angle, the video had been shot from less than a yard away from the window. But that wasn't even the worst part. Whoever was behind the camera was naked and pleasuring himself while filming her. After that, he sent more photos and videos just like it. Ellie was terrified. This man wasn't just stalking her online, he was trespassing on her property. Somehow, he had found out where she lived, even though she had never shared her address publicly. Eventually, she went to the police and gave them everything she had, his accounts, the messages, and those disturbing videos he'd filmed right outside her house. But the local department's response was, to put it mildly, underwhelming. Instead of opening a case under a statute that recognized Ellie was in real danger, they brushed it off as simple telephone harassment. Investigators did try to figure out who was behind the fake accounts, but they quickly hit a wall. It turned out the man had been using virtual phone numbers from a website that required a court order to release any user information. And apparently, the police didn't feel like jumping through those hoops, so they shelved the case. They didn't even attach the photos or videos he'd taken through Ellie's window to the file, even though that was a clear violation of the law. In the end, the only advice they gave her was to avoid going out after dark, keep her curtains closed, and maybe take a self-defense class. Ellie was devastated by the fact that the police had done virtually nothing and started to feel completely powerless in the face of what was happening. She told all her friends and family about the situation, and none of them could understand why the police were just standing by. Meanwhile, the messages from her stalker kept coming, no matter how many times Ellie tried to cut off contact. Eventually, the constant stress pushed her into serious anxiety, and depression. She couldn't focus on anything except the fear this man had instilled in her, and the lack of support from law enforcement only made things worse. Her mom also tried reaching out to the police. They did send a patrol car, but the officer simply drove down the street, stayed for about 5 minutes, and then left. Things continued like this until May. One day, while Ellie was talking to a friend about the whole situation, he managed to trace one of the stalker's fake Snapchat accounts back to a real social media profile. It turned out the account belonged to a man named Michael Strauss. Ellie immediately recognized this name. They had briefly dated when she was 17, but hadn't really kept in touch since then. As soon as she realized who was behind it all, Ellie went back to the police. But, as expected, they still didn't take any real action. They never questioned Michael, never warned him, and basically did nothing to protect her. So once again, Ellie was left completely unprotected. Even knowing her stalker's identity didn't change a thing. And the messages didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Michael started sending direct threats. Ellie became terrified of staying home alone, so her friends took turns spending the night at her place. But on the day she stopped responding to messages, no one had been able to stay over. She had asked the same friend who had come by earlier that day, but he was dealing with a bad toothache and didn't want to be a burden, thinking he wouldn't be able to sleep anyway. Now that Ellie had vanished, the police finally got to work and started by looking into her phone activity. They discovered that her phone stayed in the house until around 3 a.m., and then it was turned off. Investigators also got access to her social media accounts and found that shortly before she disappeared, Ellie had been messaging with someone named Nate. She'd asked him to come over, and he agreed. He also mentioned that he wouldn't be bringing his phone and said he'd just knock on the door when he got there. But according to the messages, Ellie later canceled those plans. Still, when detectives started digging into Nate's account, they uncovered a disturbing twist. It was registered to a virtual phone number from the same website the stalker had used. Ellie's friends also told police that she had been talking to Nate for about 6 months, but had never actually met him in person. Based on all this, investigators suspected that Nate never existed, and it had been the stalker all along. What made it even worse was that Ellie had told him she was home by herself. Soon after, detectives got a warrant and requested all the data linked to the stalker's fake accounts. As expected, everything pointed directly to Michael Strauss. And notably, all those fake accounts went completely silent the same night Ellie disappeared. Detectives started digging into Michael's background, and what they found was alarming. He had a lengthy criminal record that included burglary, public indecency, harassment, and fraud. After one arrest, he'd even been ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, which resulted in a court-mandated year of counseling. But despite everything he'd done, Michael had never spent a single day behind bars. Police paid him a visit, hoping to get some answers, but Michael denied everything, and they left empty-handed. A few days later, though, investigators secured a warrant and searched his home, seizing all of his devices. The analysis revealed that Michael's phone had pinged near Ellie's house on the night she disappeared. They also found proof that he was behind the fake accounts. In fact, just 53 minutes after Ellie's phone had gone dark, Michael created a brand new account and began messaging a different woman, once again posing as an anonymous stalker. Inside his house, officers made even more disturbing discoveries. They found Ellie's driver's license, a clump of her hair, and a stone from the necklace she always wore. They also found a pair of real handcuffs bolted to his bed. And that wasn't all. A deeper look into Michael's online activity revealed some truly chilling details. 4 months before Ellie vanished, he had searched, "How long does a human body smell?" 3 weeks before, he was looking up cases of missing women in the area. A week later, he Googled, "How to survive in prison." He also repeatedly searched for Ellie's social media profiles and checked out pages of local businesses near her home. Just 10 hours before she went missing, Michael read an article about a serial killer known as the Cincinnati Strangler. A few days later, he looked up another serial killer, then searched, how to delete photos from iCloud. At that point, the evidence was overwhelming. Everything pointed to Michael's involvement in Ellie's disappearance, and detectives were almost certain she was no longer alive. But they still didn't know where her body was, until they discovered something interesting. On Michael's phone, investigators also found a screenshot from Google Maps. It showed an open field not far from his house. Cell tower data also confirmed that his phone had been in that area on the night Ellie vanished. So police headed out there with search dogs, and it didn't take long for them to find human remains, hidden deep in the tall grass. By then, nearly a month had passed since Ellie went missing, and the body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Still, forensic experts were able to confirm her identity through dental records. It was Ellie. As for her cause of death, the level of decomposition made it hard to say for sure. There were no obvious signs of trauma, but the evidence suggested she may have been strangled. On top of that, Michael had specifically researched serial killers who used strangulation as their method of killing, so detectives believed it was a strong possibility. Right after that, Michael was arrested and brought in for questioning. This time, he changed his story, admitting that he had killed Ellie, but the version he gave was just bizarre. According to Michael, Ellie had actually agreed to film a disturbing adult video with him, something involving torture, which he planned to sell to one of his regular clients for a hefty payout. But during the shoot, he claimed things spiraled out of control. He said he didn't realize how much force he was using and ended up accidentally strangling her. Michael also claimed that the entire thing was caught on camera. After realizing Ellie was dead, he said he watched the footage and then tossed the memory card. Naturally, detectives didn't believe a word of it. His story didn't match the facts, and with the mountain of evidence against him, prosecutors were already in a strong position to secure a conviction. Based on everything they'd gathered, the most likely scenario was that Michael lured Ellie out of her house, possibly by threatening her, and then brought her back to his place. Forensic experts confirmed that her wrists had been bound with zip ties. Once inside, Michael handcuffed her to his bed and killed her, then later dumped her body in a field near his home. But investigators still had another big question to answer. Could Michael be connected to any other crimes? Because aside from the overwhelming amount of evidence in Ellie's case, his devices revealed something else. Dozens of photos and videos of random women, most of them jogging in local parks or walking alone. In many of the clips, Michael was either secretly filming them from his car or following them on foot with a hidden camera. When detectives asked about the footage, Michael didn't deny anything. He admitted he liked recording attractive women whenever he got the chance, but insisted he never actually hurt anyone. Still, the search history on his phone told a darker story. He looked up things like, "Where do women jog in Westchester?" and had also searched for news about attacks on female joggers in the area. Police started digging into other unsolved cases in the area and soon came across one that closely matched Michael's pattern. About 6 months before Ellie's murder, a woman was attacked while jogging in a nearby town called Mason. An unknown man ran up behind her and tried to drag her into the woods, but she managed to fight him off and escape. What stood out was that Michael had Googled this exact case multiple times, according to his search history, so detectives were nearly certain he was responsible. But without physical evidence, they couldn't charge him. They also began to wonder if Michael could be linked to another unsolved murder from back in 2011, the killing of 21-year-old college student Caitlin Markham, whose story we've already covered on this channel. She disappeared under eerily similar circumstances, and her body was found nearly 2 years later. Police have never identified a suspect, but now they started to seriously consider Michael. Digging deeper, they found out that Caitlin had told friends about being stalked by a man she didn't know. But then came a truly unexpected lead. On one of Michael's old social media pages, police found a photo from a music festival. He was standing with a group of people, and one of them was Caitlin's fiancé. That confirmed Michael at least knew someone close to the victim. But despite this connection, investigators couldn't find anything concrete to link him to Caitlin's case. While Michael was sitting in jail awaiting trial for Ellie's murder, one of his cellmates came forward with a tip. He claimed that Michael had confessed to killing another woman named Shelley and said he'd hidden her body near a river. But despite looking into the story, detectives weren't able to find any unsolved cases that matched the details the cellmate had given them. So, even though there were plenty of suspicious threads tying Michael to other possible crimes, he was never formally charged with anything beyond Ellie's case. When the case finally went to trial, the prosecution laid out a strong lineup of evidence pointing straight to Michael. They argued that the murder wasn't some tragic accident, it was planned, and there was no question about who was behind it. Meanwhile, Michael's defense attorney had nothing substantial to offer in his client's favor. So instead, he tried to blame Ellie for what happened to her. He told the jury that Ellie struggled with anxiety and depression and took some medication for it, suggesting that the pills might have caused her death. Needless to say, it was a ridiculous claim. Prosecutors quickly shut that down, making it clear that Ellie's health had nothing to do with the fact that she was abducted from her own home and murdered. Even with a mountain of evidence stacked against Michael, the prosecution eventually offered him a plea deal. Maybe they were worried that, without something concrete like DNA evidence, the jury might hesitate and Michael could end up walking free. 2.5 years after Ellie's death, Michael finally took the deal and pleaded guilty in front of a judge. He showed up to the hearing with visible bruises, likely from fellow inmates, and gave a short statement. He claimed he never meant to kill anyone and said he regretted what he'd done. He also apologized to Ellie's family, who were present in the courtroom, and even managed to squeeze out a few tears. But because of the plea deal, the judge found himself in a tough spot. 6 of the 9 charges had to be dropped, which significantly impacted the sentence, so Michael was given life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 17.5 years. As unfair as that may sound, it doesn't guarantee he'll ever be released. The parole board can, and likely will, deny his release for decades. In a surprising moment, even Michael's own mother spoke during the hearing, urging the court to give her son the harshest sentence possible. So, the man responsible for Ellie's murder ended up behind bars, but that brought little comfort to her friends and family. Everyone close to her understood that it wasn't just Michael's actions that led to her death, it was also the complete inaction of the police. They had multiple chances to intervene and protect her, but failed every time. After her murder, the local police department launched an internal investigation. As a result, the officer who took Ellie's initial stalking report was suspended for just 40 unpaid hours. One final note, the case of Caitlin Markham, the one where Michael was once considered a possible suspect, was finally solved in 2023. It turned out the killer was Caitlin's fiancé, who had managed to stay under the radar for years. The fact that he was friends with Michael, and that both of them turned out to be violent predators, raises a chilling question. Did they know about each other's crimes? Or worse, were they committing some of them together? Brianna Kupfer was born on April 9, 1997, in Los Angeles, California. She grew up in a big, lively family with a younger sister and 2 brothers. From an early age, Brianna stood out for how driven she was. She was a straight-A student, the captain of her school's cheerleading team, and someone who always seemed to be surrounded by friends. Later, she went on to study public relations at the University of Miami and even spent some time in Australia as part of a student exchange program. After graduating, Brianna moved back home and enrolled in a graduate program at UCLA, focusing on architectural and interior design. She was deeply passionate about creativity, especially fashion. Brianna loved sketching designs, sewing her own clothes, and dreamed of one day launching her own collection. She was also very active. She practiced yoga, danced, and even took up boxing. After returning to Los Angeles, she lived with her parents for a while, but eventually decided to move closer to campus and got an apartment with a friend. To help cover living expenses, Brianna started working as a consultant at a high-end furniture store. On January 13th, 2022, 24-year-old Brianna headed out for her usual shift. That day, she was scheduled to run the store on her own because she'd agreed to cover a shift for one of her coworkers. At around 1:30 in the afternoon, Brianna sent her manager a message. "Can you call me? There's a customer here and I'm getting a weird feeling." But the manager didn't see the message right away. A few minutes later, when she finally called Brianna back, there was no answer. She then tried calling the store's landline, and again, no response. Around that same time, a couple walked into the store. Right away, they noticed something was off. There was no one at the front. As they stepped further inside, they noticed something strange behind one of the sofas. When they got closer, they realized with horror that it was a person, covered in blood. The couple immediately ran out of the store and called the police. Officers rushed to the scene and found a young woman lying motionless on the floor, and it was clear she was already gone. Her phone was on the floor near her hand, and judging by the sheer amount of blood around her, they immediately suspected she'd been stabbed multiple times. It also didn't take long for them to confirm that the victim was Brianna. Her body was sent to the medical examiner while detectives began combing through the crime scene. Naturally, their first thought was that this might have been a robbery gone wrong, but that theory didn't hold up for long. Nothing of value had been taken, not even the cash from the register. In fact, it was the opposite. The killer had actually left something behind. Sitting on the counter where Brianna had been working was a small voice recorder, and it was still running. The officers hit play on the recorder, and what they heard left them stunned. It started with the soft jingle of the bell above the store's front door, followed by Brianna's cheerful voice greeting a customer. Then came a man's voice, saying that he and his girlfriend were looking for a new couch. Brianna asked him a few questions and offered to show him some of the models on display. A moment later, the man said he needed to call his girlfriend to check with her and stepped outside. A little while later, he came back in and asked Brianna if she could give him her social media profile, but she politely declined. Then, out of nowhere, he asked her if she followed Biden's politics. Brianna simply replied, "No." He said he'd come back later, and Brianna offered him a business card. But instead of leaving, he stayed and started saying strange things. "I think this government's gone crazy," the man muttered. Then he told her, "Put your phone down." A few seconds later, he added, "Relax, I'm not going to hurt you." Then, detectives heard the sound of a blade being drawn. Brianna's voice shifted. She was clearly scared. She told the man to leave the store and warned him that she had already called the police. But he didn't listen. In the next moments, captured in chilling detail, the man lunged at her with the knife and began stabbing her. It went on for several minutes. Brianna's terrified voice could be heard pleading with him, saying she could help him, trying anything to make him stop. But he didn't. Eventually, her voice went silent. The attacker walked out, leaving only an eerie stillness on the tape. Moments later, Brianna's phone started ringing. It was her manager, trying to call her back. A few minutes after that, the recording captured the sound of the couple entering the store and discovering her body. And that wasn't the only audio stored on the device. Months before the murder, the same man had made another recording where he ranted about how much he hated women. Detectives sent the recorder off to a lab so experts could test it for fingerprints and DNA, and then they moved on to reviewing the store's surveillance footage. There were several cameras in the building, but none of them actually covered the area where the attack happened. Still, the suspect was caught on video when he first approached Brianna's counter. He was wearing a hoodie with the hood up, dark sunglasses, and a medical mask, making it impossible to see his face. From what they could tell, he was roughly average height, medium build, and appeared to be African American. He was also picked up on outdoor cameras right after the murder, walking away from the store. During a thorough sweep of the store, crime scene investigators found a bloody shoe print on one of the couches. likely left when Brianna tried to run outside and the attacker leapt over the couch to cut her off. They also recovered the murder weapon, a 7-inch blade that had been bent from the sheer force of the stabbing. Not long after, the coroner's report came back. Brianna had been stabbed 46 times. There were also no signs of sexual assault. All of this painted a grim picture for detectives. It looked like they were dealing with someone who had no real motive other than the urge to kill. And judging by the way he was dressed, investigators also considered the possibility that the man might be homeless, which made tracking him down even harder. While waiting on the lab results, detectives kept digging for more surveillance footage, anything that might show the suspect again. Before long, they discovered that about 30 minutes after the murder, he walked into a grocery store. They also got a tip from an employee at a chiropractic clinic located just a few doors down from Brianna's workplace. She told police that the man had come in only minutes before the murder, asked a few questions about their services, and then left. Detectives canvassed other businesses along that same street and learned that the man had walked into several of them as well, only to leave almost immediately. Piecing everything together, they realized he'd likely been hunting for someone who was alone. In every other place he'd tried, there were either multiple staff members or other customers present. In total, he'd gone into 6 different businesses before finally walking into Brianna's store. News of Brianna's murder spread through Los Angeles like wildfire, sparking outrage across the city. People were furious, not just because of what happened to Brianna, but because crime in Los Angeles had been climbing at an alarming rate, while officials seemed to be doing little to stop it. In fact, many pointed to controversial policies like zero bail releases for suspects and reduced time requirements for early parole as part of the problem. There was also anger over the fact that Brianna had been left to work in the store alone, a circumstance that many believed had made her an easy target. But all the media attention also gave detectives a glimmer of hope that someone might recognize the killer. Police released photos of the man through social media and news outlets, and they announced a massive reward, $250,000, for any information leading to his arrest. Most of that reward money came from the store where Brianna worked. The size of the reward attracted hundreds of tips, but none of them led anywhere. Days went by with no breakthrough until the lab results finally came in. Forensic experts matched DNA found on the murder weapon to a 31-year-old man named Sean Smith. Even so, just as detectives had suspected, Sean had no fixed address, which made finding him a lot harder. Police sent out information about him all over the city, and soon after, the media got hold of Sean's criminal record. It turned out he'd been arrested over and over again for a mix of minor and more serious crimes, things like drug possession and theft, but also incidents that were far more alarming. Once, he attacked a police officer and bit his finger. In another case, he fired a flare gun into a car with a child inside. He'd also been arrested multiple times for trespassing. Not long before Brianna's murder, Sean had been released early from yet another short prison sentence and almost immediately violated the terms of his release. But instead of being sent back to prison, he simply vanished, slipping through the cracks of the system. When people learned all of this, their anger only grew. Here was a man who had been given chance after chance, serving short sentences and walking free again and again, until he finally committed a murder that might have been prevented. Meanwhile, detectives kept chasing down every tip that came in, but none of them brought them any closer to finding Sean. This went on until January 19th. That day, they got a call from a man driving through the city. He told police he'd just seen someone who looked exactly like the suspect from the CCTV footage. To be sure, he circled the block and drove past him again, this time noticing the exact same backpack that had been seen in the surveillance footage. Officers rushed to the area and soon spotted the man. He matched Sean's description perfectly, but when they approached him, he gave them a different name. Of course, they didn't buy it. Instead, they brought a portable fingerprint scanner, and within minutes, it confirmed what they already suspected. The man standing in front of them was Sean Smith. he was taken into custody on the spot. But even then, Sean refused to admit what he'd done. Prosecutors immediately made it clear they'd be pursuing the harshest sentence possible, but the death penalty was never on the table. Despite the fact that many people in the city were calling for it, the district attorney publicly stated that he opposed capital punishment, saying it wasn't an effective deterrent and calling it a racially biased practice. A few months after his arrest, Sean underwent a full psychiatric evaluation, and the results were clear. He had been fully aware of his actions. Then, out of nowhere, he announced that he wanted to represent himself in court. The judge granted him that right, but it didn't last long. At his very first hearing, Sean lashed out and insulted the judge. The court immediately revoked his right to self-representation and assigned him a public defender instead. Not long after that, Sean entered an official plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, despite the psychiatric evaluation clearly showing the opposite. The main trial began in late August 2024, 3 years after the murder. By that time, the prosecution had everything they needed: surveillance footage, fingerprints, and DNA evidence. For Sean, the only hope left was to convince the jury he was insane at the time of the crime. The defense had no real arguments to prove his innocence. They didn't call a single witness, nor did they present any evidence. Instead, Sean's attorney focused on trying to convince the jury that this was a spontaneous act, not something premeditated, even though it was clear from the investigation that Sean had walked into 6 other businesses looking for a victim before attacking Brianna. The attorney also tried to play on the jury's emotions, arguing that this case only got so much media attention because Brianna was white and Sean was African American, suggesting the whole thing was unfairly biased. During the trial, the court also played the tape from the recorder, the one that captured Brianna's final moments. Before it started, the judge gave her family permission to step outside, sparing them from having to relive that horror. Later, the judge ordered that this recording must never be released to the public. The jury also listened to other recordings, one where Sean spoke openly about his hatred toward women and his desire to hurt them. By the time the trial wrapped up, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury spent barely an hour behind closed doors before returning to the courtroom, and their decision was clear. Sean was guilty. A few months later, he was brought back before the judge for sentencing. Several psychiatrists evaluated him once again, and every single one of them concluded that there were no serious mental conditions that could excuse what he'd done. On top of that, the judge played several recordings taken from the jail where Sean had been waiting for trial. In 3 separate phone calls with friends and relatives, he openly said that all he had to do was play crazy, and instead of prison, he'd be sent to a hospital for 5 years, and then walk free. He spoke with complete confidence that his plan would work, apparently forgetting that every word of those calls was being recorded. Because of those recordings, there was no longer any doubt. Sean was ruled mentally competent and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. However, there was a catch. Under new California laws, even people given life without parole are technically allowed to apply for parole later on. Still, the judge said he hoped every single one of Sean's future petitions would be denied, given the sheer brutality of his crime. As for his motive, no clear reason ever came out during the trial. Based on the recordings from his own recorder, Sean simply harbored a deep hatred for women and wanted to hurt them. And the fact that he walked into 6 other businesses before attacking Brianna shows one chilling thing. He didn't care who it was, as long as it was a woman. So, Sean was sent off to serve his sentence. But Brianna's case didn't end there. It became yet another stark reminder of how flawed the legal and correctional systems can be. Systems that let dangerous offenders slip through the cracks, serve only light sentences, and walk free even when they pose a clear threat to others. And yet, despite the outrage and the calls for change, nothing meaningful has been done to fix the situation. In California, a lenient attitude toward offenders still remains, even in the face of cases like this. In Brianna's memory, hundreds of people gathered outside the store where her life was taken. They built a makeshift memorial filled with flowers, her photos, and signs demanding action, pleading with authorities to finally do something about the violence in their city.